Welcome to Dialogue. This conversation is part of a series on the analysis of the COVID era, and today we are executing a deep dive specifically into narrative control. We're setting the stage for a critical look at the source material we've gathered. Our mission is to understand how many official assertions during the COVID era were not only later proven incorrect, but were enforced in a way that fundamentally abandoned the scientific method itself. We're opening with one core warning that drives this entire conversation. When science becomes dogma, truth becomes heresy.
That gets right to the heart of the matter because we must clarify immediately. This deep dive is not about science failing. Science, in its purest form, is designed to fail, correct itself, and then move on. This is explicitly about authority masquerading as science, using the symbols of expertise to demand compliance, and daring you, the listener, or any scientist, to notice the crucial difference between genuine intellectual inquiry and a policy mandate.
And that's the key distinction.
To properly dissect this inversion, we have to define our terms up front. What was being presented as science was not science at all. Science is not defined by institutions, whether they are national or global. It is not defined by press conferences featuring a single authorized spokesperson. And critically, it is not designed by a consensus enforced by the punishment, sidelining, or public shaming of those who dare to introduce competing inconvenient data.
Exactly. The premise running through the core of this material is profound. The universe doesn't care who you are, what your degrees are, or what your political affiliation is. But during COVID, the science seemed to care very much about those things. If your questions were inconvenient to the goals of centralized policy, you were labeled an enemy of public safety. Our mission today is to understand the mechanics of how institutions designed to protect intellectual inquiry abandon that principle wholesale while simultaneously labeling any intellectual dissent, any critical question, as ignorance or worse, malice. Okay, let's unpack this by starting with the foundational principles we all learned in school, because understanding what we lost requires recalling what true scientific inquiry actually looks like. If we forget the white coats and the funding battles for a moment, what is the scientific method? It is a process, not a rigid script you read off the teleprompter.
It begins with the hypothesis. This is the starting gun. It's a testable proposition, and the critical point here is that by its very nature, it is preliminary, incomplete, and provisional. It's the beginning of the journey, not the end result.
But that's not how it was presented.
No. During the COVID era, many public health assertions were treated as irrefutable conclusions on day one, effectively skipping the rest of the method entirely.
And what defines that journey, what makes it rigorous, is the central role of falsification. This is the key insight from philosophers of science like Karl Popper. Good scientists don't spend their time gathering data solely to prove themselves right. If you want a scientific result to hold up under pressure, you must actively, rigorously, and continuously try to prove yourself wrong.
You seek out the data that contradicts your initial assumptions.
Right.
Because if your hypothesis survives your best efforts to kill it, it gains credibility.
And that's an active process.
What's fascinating here is the sheer energy required for that process. Think of the history of science. Before Einstein, Newtonian physics was the settled science of motion, a brilliant functional hypothesis.
Yeah.
But scientists didn't stop there. They sought out edge cases, like the orbit of Mercury, that Newtonian mechanics couldn't explain. The hypothesis was eventually falsified and revised by a superior one. That process, the effort to prove oneself wrong, is the engine of discovery.
Whereas during the pandemic, the system rewarded the exact opposite.
It rewarded confirmation bias, finding data that supported the existing policy and ignoring data that didn't.
And because the world is messy, dynamic, and full of emergent data, the scientific process demands constant revision. Science is iterative. It should always be changing its mind, not reluctantly, but eagerly, when new data appears. It must have the obligation to do so.
And this iterative necessity brings us to the inherent and crucial presence of uncertainty built into the scientific framework. If you don't have uncertainty, if you claim absolute knowledge about a novel phenomenon, you don't have science, you have the doctrine.
That's the real dividing line.
And that uncertainty offers the clearest contrast to the observed behavior we saw over those 2 years. If you look at the fundamental linguistic difference, real science sounds like, we think this might be true, but we could be wrong, so let's test this variable extensively.
And what did we get instead?
Official COVID science often sounded much more blunt, far less inquisitive, and often conveyed the single absolute message of, this is settled and any question is dangerous.
Or just shut up.
Exactly.
That's the social physics of this transition, right? The moment preliminary doubt or disagreement transforms into a form of heresy, the moment questioning becomes not just intellectually incorrect, but morally dangerous, the practice of science has already been ejected.
It's gone. Inquiry cannot survive when the only acceptable outcome is absolute confirmation of the current institutional position.
And we saw this inversion play out across the social and academic spheres.
Critical thinking, the very tool science relies upon, became an institutional liability.
So, questioning the underlying effectiveness or necessity of a policy, whether it was lockdowns or mandates, shifted immediately from being an essential act of scientific inquiry
To being labeled misinformation. And that word choice is deliberate.
it implies malicious intent, not intellectual curiosity.
Exactly.
And expressing legitimate doubt about evolving data, such as questioning the accuracy of early models or pointing out the weaknesses in preliminary vaccine effectiveness studies, which is what scientists are paid to do, was consistently equated with promoting danger to the community.
You are no longer a critical thinker.
No, you were a vector of confusion, a public threat.
And this is where the academic environment was crippled. Engaging in genuine debate, the cornerstone of all academic life where ideas clash violently so the strongest truth can emerge, was framed as committing social harm.
If your intellectual opponent was labeled a source of harm, you didn't need to defeat their argument with better data.
You just needed to silence them.
Through administrative means, media pressure, or social shaming.
The core insight we should carry forward from this section is that science didn't simply evolve and refine its understanding during the pandemic. Rather, it became rigidly hardened.
The goal of many institutions shifted. It was no longer primarily about seeking correctness through rigorous and adversarial debate.
No, it became about prioritizing narrative coherence and political compliance over empirical accuracy.
They needed a clean, unified message to manage public fear and ensure adherence, even if that message required ignoring inconvenient or contradictory facts. This is where we shift from philosophy to application, and here's where we get into the extensive detail the deep dive promises. The proof of this inversion is found in the data that was suppressed, dismissed, and later quietly confirmed. We can point to specific, high-stakes narratives that were projected with absolute moral certainty, presented as closed cases, that were later reversed, dramatically softened, or acknowledged as plausible. Let's unpack the idea of, trust us, this is settled.
We absolutely must begin with the lab leak hypothesis. This stands as the ultimate case study in how narrative control can completely trump scientific openness and intellectual honesty.
So, just to be clear, this is the possibility that the virus originated from a research facility.
Right, in Wuhan, potentially due to an accidental release or gain-of-function research.
Hmm.
And initially, it was aggressively and universally labeled a conspiracy theory early in 2020.
And the dismissal was often not scientific. It was moral and political. It was immediate, vehement, and bordered on moral outrage.
Oh, absolutely. Scientists who dared to raise this possibility or who even asked for a rigorous investigation into the facility's safety protocols and records were instantly silenced, ridiculed, or sidelined.
They were told it was reckless speculation.
Reckless, xenophobic rhetoric, and entirely unproven purely for asking the question.
Think about the suppression tools used here. If a competing theory had an ounce of scientific merit, and this one certainly did, given the geographic proximity and the nature of the research being conducted.
It should have been rigorously investigated alongside the natural spillover hypothesis.
Of course.
Instead, the consensus immediately coalesced around the natural origin, not because the evidence was definitive, but because the alternative was politically and diplomatically inconvenient.
And then came the profound reversal.
A huge reversal. Over time, as external journalistic pressure mounted and more details emerged regarding early research activities, the hypothesis went through a massive institutional shift.
It was later formally acknowledged by major intelligence agencies and public health leaders as not only plausible, but as one possibility that required intensive, honest investigation.
The suppression was so effective that it fundamentally limited the scope of global inquiry based on political or social optics, not on empirical impossibility.
And the observation here is telling and critical for you, the listener. It went from being dismissed as a racist tinfoil hat conspiracy to quietly becoming a credible, under-investigation hypothesis supported by various federal bodies.
And this massive shift occurred without any significant institutional apology, reflection, or public admission of error regarding the initial suppression.
So no accountability.
None. This established the precedent that official bodies could enforce absolute certainty, later reverse course when convenient, and yet avoid all accountability for having poisoned the public discourse for years.
Okay, let's move to another key scientific concept that was actively minimized: natural immunity. This is perhaps one of the most glaring examples of suppressing established biological fact to support a policy goal.
It's Immunology 101.
Right. The concept of robust, durable, post-infection immunity, the basic premise of immunology for decades, was largely ignored or minimized in public policy discussions.
The scientific reality, later confirmed by expansive, real-world population studies, notably those coming out of Israel and Qatar, showed that recovered individuals possessed highly effective and durable protection. We're talking specific T-cell and memory B-cell responses that provided broader protection against variants than initial vaccine formulations. And yet, discussion of this was actively discouraged in early policy decisions across the board, from travel requirements to employment mandates.
Why was this? Because acknowledging robust natural immunity complicated the desired narrative that universal vaccination was the only legitimate path to safety and participation in society.
It completely undermines it. If you admit that someone who recovered 6 months ago has better protection than someone who just received their first shot, the moral and logical justification for mandating that recovered person get the shot collapses entirely.
So it became an inconvenient truth.
One that had to be minimized or framed as less reliable, despite strong data suggesting the contrary.
And finally, let's analyze the messaging around vaccine transmission claims. This is where the initial social justification for mandates was built.
This was the big one.
The public messaging strongly implied, or in many instances outright guaranteed, that vaccination would provide strong prevention of spread, often referred to as sterile immunity.
People were told their moral obligation was to get the jab to protect vulnerable neighbors, grandparents, and the immunocompromised, because if they got it, they couldn't spread it.
That messaging was powerful and highly effective at driving compliance.
Incredibly effective.
However, the reality, as evidence evolved, especially with the emergence of variants like Delta and Omicron, was starkly different.
The effect on transmission proved to be limited and notably waning, often dropping significantly within months.
But the vaccines were still very good at something else.
Yes, excellent at preventing severe disease, hospitalization, and death. But the protection against infection and spread was highly imperfect and transient.
The scientific reality fundamentally changed the public health justification for forced compliance and universal mandates.
Absolutely. If the main benefit is no longer protecting your neighbor from infection, but protecting yourself from severe illness, the moral argument for forcing others to comply collapses.
But the policy didn't change with the data.
The shift in data from prevention of spread to prevention of severity was immense, yet the institutional messaging and associated mandates were slow to adapt, clinging to the original, much simpler moral justification.
The synthesis here is clear. The fundamental issue was not that institutions were simply wrong. Science is constantly wrong on its way to being right.
That's the whole point of it.
The profound anti-scientific error was the decision to pretend uncertainty did not exist when the evidence was clearly evolving, often ambiguous and contradictory.
That enforced certainty in the face of radical ambiguity is not leadership. It's an abandonment of the scientific ethic.
Now, let's shift to how evidence was chosen rather than evaluated. We move from absolute certainty to policies based on curated or intentionally cherry-picked evidence. Here's a phenomenon that speaks volumes about policy overriding principle.
The term curation is perfect here because it implies selection based on a desired aesthetic or outcome, rather than neutral, comprehensive review.
Take mask mandates. These were enforced rigorously, universally, and often for incredibly long durations, sometimes extending well into 2022 and beyond. And this was despite often having weak population-level evidence regarding their effectiveness in the real-world public setting.
And that distinction is key. We're not talking about controlled clinical environments with perfect compliance and high-quality equipment.
We're talking about community-wide implementation,
where compliance is imperfect, materials are varied, and usage is sporadic. Critics argued that policies were based on plausible biological theory, that a barrier should logically stop aerosols before the real-world large-scale data supported the population-level impact.
And yet, the mandates remained absolute. If science is about efficacy, why did we see a continuation of mandates long after randomized controlled trials, like the highly discussed Danish mask study, raised serious questions about the population-level benefit?
The data wasn't strong, but the policy was ironclad.
Contrast that with school closures. This is perhaps the most difficult case, where the sources highlight that policy ignored the severe, obvious trade-offs. These measures were maintained and extended, often for over a year, despite the known and severe developmental harm inflicted on children.
You're talking about measurable setbacks in math and literacy, skyrocketing mental health crises, and social isolation.
But I think we need to push back on that slightly. Weren't administrators simply erring on the side of caution? Isn't some degree of extreme risk aversion acceptable when facing an unknown novel virus?
That's a fair challenge, and the sources address it head-on. They argue that science requires balancing all risks.
Okay.
In this case, the immense, documented, obvious harm to children, a generation-defining impact, was consistently outweighed by a theoretical or marginal public health benefit for the broader community that was never rigorously proven to necessitate such prolonged closures.
So the risk-benefit equation was unbalanced.
Clearly unbalanced, yet the policy persisted, suggesting political convenience rather than scientific equilibrium was the deciding factor.
And what about the outside world? There was a consistent and specific tendency to engage in the dismissal of contradictory data.
If compelling European or international data, perhaps from regions like Sweden or Iceland, that adopted drastically different mitigation strategies.
Particularly regarding schools or high-risk populations.
If that data contradicted U.S. domestic policy decisions, that data was often aggressively sidelined, nitpicked, or simply ignored.
Science became geographically selective.
That's a great way to put it.
If a study from Copenhagen or Stockholm suggested something that made U.S. policy say regarding the necessity of mandates or the efficacy of border closures look questionable, suddenly we, the public, were all forced to become instant experts in Nordic cultural homogeneity, population density, and social trust patterns.
The goal wasn't to integrate new knowledge.
No, it was purely to dismiss the inconvenient finding immediately.
The critical point here is structural. Evidence was not subjected to neutral, rigorous evaluation by competing academics. It was actively curated to support a pre-existing policy stance that the institutions had already publicly committed to.
This is the inverse of science.
Exactly. In this approach, you decide the desired outcome first, pure G universal masking, school closure continuation, and then you gather or amplify only the data that supports it, while simultaneously suppressing all counter-evidence.
That shift from evaluating to curating is the hallmark of dogma overriding discovery. This successful curation of evidence leads directly to the cultural phenomenon of adherence. Following the rules and believing the approved narrative became less about objective public health metrics and more about a highly visible social signal of superiority, what we call the aesthetic of intelligence.
Precisely. The most immediate and visceral manifestation of this inversion was masking. It quickly transcended its debated empirical function in certain settings and became a highly visible moral signal.
Wearing the mask didn't just signal precaution against aerosols.
No, it signaled a person's absolute adherence to the correct political and social in-group. It was a visible badge of compliance that separated the virtuous from the perceived villains.
And because compliance had to be instant and universal, and because complexity was deemed dangerous, critical debate dissolved.
Slogans and simple repetitive hashtags began replacing complex, necessary, nuanced arguments.
You didn't need to understand viral load dynamics, aerosol transmission models, or immunology.
No, you just needed to repeat the latest public health jingle or declaration to signal your commitment and protect your social standing.
The reduction of complex reality to a slogan is the death knell of intellectual engagement.
That environment fostered profound credential worship. This was an intense over-reliance on the title or institutional affiliation of the speaker rather than the substance of the argument they were presenting.
So if the expert was from the approved institution,
their statement was treated as gospel, regardless of the quality or timeliness of the data supporting it.
And the flip side.
Conversely, if a well-credentialed scientist dared to publish something inconvenient, their entire career was reduced to fringe or discredited. This mechanism efficiently reinforced the approved in-group out-group divide.
It's the ultimate professional irony. The smartest, safest position to hold wasn't the one supported by the most robust, counter-tested data, but whatever was trending on professional social media that morning.
It was about being seen to align with the intellectual elite, not about intellectual rigor.
The smartest position was whatever was trending on LinkedIn.
It's a painful but accurate summation. Intelligence ceased being a critical practice. That difficult, necessary act of thinking deeply, reading broadly, and questioning assumptions. Instead, it became a costume, worn, not practiced.
You signaled intelligence through superficial adherence, visible compliance, and immediate public condemnation of those who deviated even slightly from the script.
And this signal intelligence led directly to social superiority through adherence.
Declaring, "I believe science," became a core identity marker, substituting for actual commitment to the difficult, uncertain process of inquiry.
The phrase meant, I believe the people in charge because they validate my worldview, not I commit to the scientific method's skepticism.
The social consequences were immediate and profound. Public shaming and the dehumanization of dissenters became common, almost accepted tools for enforcing the narrative.
If you questioned a mandate, you weren't just seen as wrong, you were seen as morally deficient, selfish, and a direct threat to public safety.
And therefore deserving of ostracization, career loss, or public ridicule.
This created a climate where people didn't just passively follow the rules, they actively weaponized them.
They used mandatory adherence to gain social standing, signal their virtue to peers, and enforce conformity within their social and professional spheres.
Compliance became a tool for social leverage against those who thought differently. The moral high ground was defined by one's capacity to conform publicly and loudly.
So we have this profound gap between what good science requires, robust debate and challenging assumptions, and what the institutions delivered, monolithic certainty and narrative control. Why did the majority of the scientific community, the people who inherently know how essential debate, skepticism, and falsification are, stay so quiet for so long? We have to investigate the powerful internal pressures that prevented open scientific discourse.
The silence was not born of universal scientific agreement. It was born of a simple, pervasive system of career incentives stacked against independent thought. For academic and research scientists, the biggest factor was the threat to grant funding, which is, quite simply, their financial survival.
Elaborate on that. What does that threat look like in practice?
It's stark. The research ecosystem runs on massive government or institutional grants, often multi-million-dollar awards. If you are seen as an unreliable voice, someone who questions the established public health narrative or the policy goals of the granting bodies, your ability to secure those grants that feed your lab, pay your staff, and define your career disappears instantly.
So just one inconvenient study.
The simple act of publishing a study with inconvenient findings puts a massive target on your back for future funding cycles. You risked everything to say one dissenting thing.
And that financial risk was compounded by direct institutional pressure.
Right. Universities, research centers, and hospitals were terrified of losing their own massive funding streams, regulatory approval, or political favor. They exerted immense pressure on faculty, sometimes informally, sometimes formally, to align their statements with the official public health messaging.
Then you add the overwhelming fear of media backlash.
Getting targeted or smeared in the national press is a huge reputation risk that can destroy a career built over decades.
And that's the substantial reputation risk associated with questioning official policy.
A scientist could lose decades of credibility overnight for simply suggesting an inconvenient finding, even if that finding was perfectly sound science confirmed by peer review.
So the incentive structure made silence the safest, most logical career move.
A decision based on personal survival rather than intellectual curiosity.
It's the bitter truth. During that period, peer review was effectively replaced with peer survival.
Scientists weren't confirming each other's data. They were confirming each other's career security by staying quiet together.
The conclusion we must draw from this observation is genuinely sobering.
The majority of working scientists did not necessarily actively agree with every single aspect of the enforced dogma. They simply stayed quiet because the career incentives were stacked against dissent.
The system was inadvertently designed to reward conformity and instantly punish curiosity.
And that pervasive silence allowed internal sociological mechanisms to take root, creating what the sources refer to as groupthink in lab coats.
This shifted the institutional focus from intellectual exploration to internal cohesion and moral righteousness.
That's right. Within the academic and scientific ecosystem, we saw consensus culture rise to absolute prominence. This prioritizes institutional agreement and harmony, the clean, unified message over the sometimes messy, contradictory path toward empirical truth.
Which is the opposite of science, where consensus is merely a starting point to be challenged.
And we saw a moral panic overriding empirical caution. The sense that the stakes were so high that every question could lead to death meant that basic methodological scrutiny, due process and peer review, and statistical caution were often thrown out the window.
If you framed your policy as saving lives, you were allowed to bypass the scientific rigor that would normally slow down the process.
And crucially, this was coupled with overwhelming authority bias. This is the psychological principle that dictates we tend to defer to those in positions of power or with high credentials, regardless of the quality of their underlying argument.
Once the public assigned moral authority to an institution, they often stopped questioning its conclusions entirely.
The badge and the title became more important than the data presented.
The ultimate painful transformation was this. Once science became deeply and unavoidably political, once the institution became a tool of one political or social alignment, maintaining professional and intellectual neutrality became the single most dangerous position for a career.
Staying neutral meant you were not actively supporting the current political alignment. And in a climate defined by certainty, silence was perceived as betrayal.
Let's discuss the profound, lasting damage caused by the difference between necessary simplification for public health and intentional deception, especially when that deception originates from the very institutions we are supposed to trust. This is the issue of institutional false confidence.
The core failure in communication was the overstated certainty. Public health leaders and institutional spokespersons consistently presented complex, rapidly evolving data, hypotheses, and preliminary findings as solid, unchangeable fact.
Why?
They felt they needed to project absolute confidence to ensure the maximum level of public compliance, speed, and uniformity in behavior.
The problem is that when you simplify messaging to ensure maximum compliance, there is a distinct point where that simplified messaging turns into deception.
Nuanced truths, such as the limited duration of vaccine efficacy, the robustness of natural immunity data, or the initial uncertainties of the virus's origin, were consistently omitted purely to ensure compliance with a broad, monolithic public health directive.
Can you give a concrete example?
Think about the messaging around surfaces. For months, the public was told to rigorously wipe down groceries and disinfect mail, a narrative that generated massive social stress and compliance.
Right, I remember that.
Yet, the data rapidly showed that aerosol transmission was the overwhelming route, and surface transmission was negligible. This overemphasis on surfaces persisted long after the science contradicted it, because the message, wash your hands, wipe your surfaces, was simple and easy to enforce.
And the consequence is predictable and severe.
This systematic approach dramatically eroded public trust.
When the public realizes they were intentionally misled, that nuance was withheld or outright falsified, even if the institution claimed it was for their own protection, the trust relationship is permanently severed.
The public may forgive a mistake, but they rarely forgive intentional withholding of information.
What's fascinating here is understanding the underlying psychological motivation behind this deception. It's often not malicious in the sense of pure evil.
Right. The sources suggest that many institutions didn't suppress inconvenient truths merely to control you. They did it because they genuinely didn't trust the public to handle the complexity or uncertainty inherent in rapidly developing scientific knowledge.
So they thought we couldn't handle the truth.
They believed the public was incapable of rational, nuanced risk assessment and would instead fall into chaos or non-compliance if given the full picture.
This assumption that complexity must be eliminated for the public good, often referred to as a noble lie, brings us to why truth itself became the enemy of the centralized narrative.
Exactly. Truth was fundamentally inconvenient for centralized narrative control for three critical self-reinforcing reasons. First, it complicates messaging. Imagine a public health campaign where the slogan is, vaccine efficacy against transmission might be 70% against Delta, but waning to 30% against Omicron, unless you had prior infection, in which case the protection is likely higher.
That's a nightmare to communicate. It's much harder to create simple, effective mandates when you have to include qualifiers and uncertainty estimates.
Second, truth reduces compliance. If the risks and benefits are perceived as conditional or less certain, or if the data shows the benefit is rapidly waning, mass behavioral compliance drops off sharply.
People are much more likely to comply instantly and universally with an absolute fear-driven demand than a conditional request based on subtle data analysis.
And third, and perhaps the most threatening to institutional control, truth encourages autonomy. When people are presented with complex, evolving, and sometimes contradictory data, it empowers them to make their own nuanced risk assessments based on their own personal health status, age, exposure level, and circumstances.
Rather than blindly following a centralized dictate designed for the average population.
The moment people start performing their own risk-benefit analysis, centralized control is lost.
The final conclusion for this section is critical. Truth wasn't suppressed because it was factually wrong. In many cases, the suppressed information was simply uncertain truth that hadn't finished evolving.
It was suppressed because it was inconvenient to the primary goals of narrative cohesion, maintaining social superiority, and ensuring mass compliance.
We have to focus now on the tangible long-term damage that this inversion of science has inflicted on key public health bodies and the social fabric. The collapse of institutional trust is arguably the single most dangerous outcome of the entire era.
The sources make the damage unavoidable and clear. We've seen a permanent, significant loss of CDC credibility and the credibility of analogous public health bodies in the eyes of a massive segment of the population.
This has led to a resulting surge in generalized public skepticism that now targets all official health and scientific pronouncements, regardless of how robust the evidence is, because the initial trust was broken.
Moreover, this breakdown further fueled political polarization to a staggering degree.
Public health, which should be a neutral, objective field based on empirical data, became inextricably linked with partisan identity.
Trust in a public health body now often depends entirely on which political party is perceived to align with that institution, or which social identity group one belongs to.
The crucial point here is one of moral authority.
When institutions engage in deception, when they systematically withhold nuance, simplify past the point of accuracy, or use the noble lie defense, they irrevocably lose the moral right to be believed in the future.
Once trust is broken by intentional omission, the entire foundation of public health messaging collapses.
Which makes future crises, whether pandemics or environmental, far harder to manage effectively.
That loss of foundation requires us to provide the crucial final definitions for the listener, distinguishing true science, the self-correcting method we rely on, from scientism, the dangerous, authoritative substitute we received during the pandemic.
Let's nail this down clearly. Science is defined as the open, rigorous inquiry process, characterized by debate, the conscious effort toward falsification, intellectual humility, and continuous doubt.
Science is the willingness to say, I was wrong, and here is the new data.
Exactly. And scientism is defined not as a pursuit of knowledge, but as obedience disguised as expertise.
It uses the language, symbols, and credentials of science to enforce specific political or social behaviors and to silence dissent.
Scientism demands acceptance of an established truth rather than continuous critical review.
So we can summarize the entire conflict with one key distinction that you can take with you.
True science asks questions and demands evidence.
Scientism asks for compliance and demands silence. Let's synthesize our entire journey into one final thought for you. The COVID era did not primarily reveal how dangerous isolated fringe misinformation is. It revealed how dangerous institutional certainty can be when it substitutes obedience for the necessary difficulty of honest, open inquiry.
The ultimate critical takeaway from the source material is this. The greatest anti-science act of the pandemic was the sustained institutional pretense that the debate was definitively over, when, in fact, the underlying science was still rapidly evolving, filled with unresolved questions about risks, benefits, and long-term consequences.
And that leads to the final, painful truth that we must carry forward as we analyze future crises. When science needs censorship, it has already failed. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.